Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. So I am going to be talking to you about the meaning of words today. Words have meaning, and particularly I'm going to be talking about some of those words that are to do with food and how some confusion around those words links to our sustainability goals. Now, semantics is really, really, really important, and some words are really hard to define. So if those words get used by different people, when they are using those words with different meanings, obviously misunderstandings are going to arise. And we do see this sometimes with politics. And I mean, if you really want to divide a room, ask people about the meaning of woke or Brexit or justice, but you might not get invited to that dinner party again. So I'm going to be talking to you about words to do with food. And food is really complicated. It's messy, it's personal, it's cultural, it's political. And as Anthony Warner says here, anyone trying to tell you otherwise is trying to sell you something. And because food is so complicated, I think that the words we use to describe it, we have to be really, really careful with that meaning. So I'm going to talk a bit about sausages and then get on to the sustainability for the next 15 minutes. We're going to explore the meaning of some of these words. And the first one we're going to start with is this word here, processed. Now, this was my lunch today. We eat loads of processed food all the time, such as this beans on toast. Now, here, the bread, I had some whole wheat bread, the wheat had been milled, the tins of beans had been put through a high pressure, high temperature factory to kill any bacteria and to cook the beans. And then the margarine is an emulsion of oil and water, so there's lots of processing that's gone into this meal. Processing is just a really essential part of our modern food system. It means that our food is safe. It means that our food is affordable, and it means that it can be preserved, which is really important for storage and transportation. And processing is really ancient. This isn't a modern thing. Here we've got some Romans merrily stomping on some grapes. They're doing some physical processing here. In a moment, they'll do some microbiology, and they'll use yeast to ferment that grape must to make wine. And another really ancient use of yeast is making bread. Now, today, a glass of wine and some bread is completely normal. But imagine being the first person to turn grape juice into wine or bread to make bread rise. It would seem absolutely crazy. And that's because foods, when they first come onto the scene, if they're novel, they can seem really weird. And this is kind of hardwired into us. Foods that we don't know what they are, or if we haven't seen them before, we should be skeptical of them because they might be unsafe. This is evolutionarily sort of hardwired into us. And we call this food neophobia. So, for example, my beans on toast would look crazy to somebody about 150 years ago, but hopefully to all of you today, this looks like a pretty normal lunch. Now, there's one bit of the beans on toast that would look particularly weird, and that's the margarine that I had. So, margarine was invented in 1869, and I really hope somebody in the future will do a Nerd Night talk on the history of margarine, because it is wild. And it was met with skepticism. It was described as a mechanical mixture made through the ingenuity of depraved human genius. So it's just humble margarine. But you can already see here that there's some skepticism over the processing that's being used to make this food. And we can go on. Here's a quote here, and I said at the beginning about how food is really tied up with our emotional and social values, and you can see here, it's really being described in these strong terms. This, by the way, fantastic article, Fight Over the Demon Spread. And here's a cartoon from an American newspaper at the time, and you can see this three-headed hydra is being used to depict this monstrous product, which is margarine. Newspapers would run articles questioning its health benefits, and the language used, people were trying to police the language that was used to describe margarine. And I think what this shows is that acceptance takes time, because ultimately, margarine was a better product than butter. Quality was more reliable, it was cheaper, so it took off. So here we've got an example of a processed alternative to a conventional animal product that today is completely normal. Another example of this is oat milk. My parents never grew up with oat milk, but to us it seems just like something we all have in our coffee all the time. It was developed in the 1990s by a Swedish person who was looking at lactose intolerance. He actually then went on to found Oatly. And it's often now the default in a coffee shop. So here we've got something called the shifting baseline. And it's this idea that what seems normal to us today wasn't normal to people perhaps a generation ago. And that change might seem jarring at first, but we just update our mental software and get on with things. So, on to our first definition. Well, actually, after the intro, our second definition of the night. So processing, diverse range of activities, could be physical, could be chemical, and we're talking about changing the properties of food. So we've seen this already with the bread and the wine, we've seen it with the margarine that I mentioned, and oat milk. These are 4 types of processed foods. And this is a word that's often confused with something else, which is formulation. So formulation is more to do with the ingredients, the combination of the quantity to give foods certain properties. So an example of this might be adding some vanilla flavouring, or perhaps adding some vitamin B12 to fortify a food. So I think of formulation as the ingredients and processing as a bit like the recipe. So, to summarise, food processing is ancient. There's lots of benefits to it. They can seem weird at first, but we get used to them, and today we eat tons of processed foods. So, onto this phrase here, ultra-processed food, or UPF. This was a phrase that was coined in 2009, and understanding a definition of this is the crux to my whole talk. So, we need to understand a bit of the context before we look at what this word means. So this phrase was developed by a Brazilian academic called Carlos Monteiro. And he saw that there were changes happening in his native Brazil, that people were shifting from eating a diet that was cooked at home, something like rice and beans, and they were eating more foods that were fast food, essentially. And he wrote in his seminal 2009 paper, he was highlighting how this was changing in Brazil the social life, this was changing the experience of cooking together, and this was changing the food customs. And he was also concerned about rising obesity and rising rates of diabetes. So he tried to come up with a way to solve all of these problems and to categorize foods that were made on an industrial scale, because that's what he saw as the issue that was behind all of this. And the scheme that he came up with is called the Nova classification. Now, Nova means new in Portuguese, and there are these 4 categories of foods. So, Nova category 1, minimally processed foods. An apple would be an example. Category 2, these are processed culinary ingredients, perhaps some oil or some salt. If you mix 1 and 2 together, you get category 3, which are processed foods. This might be some bread made at home. And it's this last category that's really interesting, Nova category 4, or ultra-processed food. So, defining this is easier said than done. And for a talk that's all about semantics, it's important to really take a close look at the definition of this. It's not easy, because for a start, it is 7 paragraphs long. Okay, I'm not going to get you to read this. We don't have time. But there are also some caveats. It's not widely accepted. Other definitions exist. This is the most commonly used definition of ultra-processed food, which is why I've used it in my research. It confuses formulation and processing, which you now all know are slightly different to one another. And it's not objective. If you go away and look through this definition after the talk, you can see that it uses phrases like some of these, or some of the foods are usually, okay? So it's quite subjective. And what Monteiro has done here is he's developed a really good way of identifying foods that are made in factories. It's more of a sort of subjective, socio-political construct than it is something to use in a scientific setting. And I think the key phrase here is he talks about foods that have no domestic equivalents. He's talking about foods that aren't, foods and processes and ingredients that aren't found in household kitchens. And because that definition is really unwieldy, you might have seen some of these shorthands that have been used. So perhaps you've heard people talk about ultra-processed foods being wrapped in plastic, or containing something you can't pronounce. I mean, that's pretty subjective. Or having more than 5 ingredients. But there are problems with these shorthands as well, because, I mean, cling film is essentially a plastic. There's lots of things that are difficult to pronounce, but are really, really important. And plenty of ingredients, if you look at recipes for lots of foods, they have way more than 5 ingredients. So, let's do a quick quiz. Now that we've kind of got, with a sprinkling of minimally processed salt, which of these foods do you think would come under that Nova category for? Audience participation, please. All of them, yes, correct, well done. All of these, the Weetabix, the oat milk, the hummus, all of these would be classed as ultra-processed food. And that's telling us that these foods were made in a factory by probably a reasonably large company. And that could be useful information. If you want to categorize foods and if you value foods on the basis of where they are made, then the Nova classification is really useful, okay? But that is almost exclusively not how it is being used today. So, you might have seen headlines like this, or this. And that's because the NOVA classification is being used to classify foods on the basis of how healthy they are. And I think this is a real problem. And if we go back to that 2009 paper by Montero, he literally says here, the issue is not food nor nutrients so much as processing. He's literally saying the issue is not nutrients, okay? But you can see there's some confusion because he's talking about nutrition and health here, okay? And this has led to like pretty widespread confusion in nutrition circles as to what this definition is used for. And I think Montero had some really, really good intentions. He saw all of these challenges in Brazil and he wanted a way of classifying foods that he saw as problematic. But we simply can't talk about whether a food is healthy or not without considering the nutritional value of that food. And I think Kieran Ford here puts it really well, where he talks about how the nutritive properties of a food are not influenced by whether they're produced for profit, affordability, convenience, or palatability. Because if we were to think about the NOVA scale, we would say that an ultra-processed chocolate cake that's made in a factory is worse than an equivalent chocolate cake that was made at home that might be NOVA category 3, even if these two foods had identical nutritional properties. That just makes no sense to me. So, quick summary, we've defined processing, formulation, and UPF. We've said that processing is ancient, new processed foods might be distrusted, it's really subjective, but it does a good job of telling us if food's made in factories, but it's mistakenly being used about how healthy a food is. So let's look at this last thing. If we do want to know how healthy a food is, what should we do? Well, we already have that information. Okay, if we're interested in nutrition, we should look at nutrition labels. And we have a fantastic system in the UK where we can use quantitative measures such as this food here. You can see that it's particularly high in sugar. And this will have been calculated because someone will have looked at how much sugar per 100 grams of product there is. Okay, it's a really objective measure. Now, there are some ultra-processed foods that are bad for you. Here we have an example of a crisp that is literally called Nova. No, I think that's just a correlation. And there are plenty of ultra-processed foods that are bad for you because they're high in fats, sugar, and salt. And we already have a name for that. They're junk foods. And there are also plenty of foods that come into the other NOVA categories that it would be not a great idea to eat in excess. So butter in NOVA 2 and that chocolate cake I mentioned in NOVA 3. So I think it's really key to note that within this ultra-processed food category, we've got all of these junk foods, but then we've also got a load of foods that aren't junk foods, that are being tarred with the same brush by people that are using this categorization to suggest that all of these foods are unhealthy. That includes my lunch, and it also includes some things like infant formula that are really important functional foods, and they're being put in this group because they are made in a factory. So let's talk about some of the science that's been done with this, because we've seen that the NOVA categories are a poor proxy for how healthy a food is, but that hasn't stopped nutrition scientists using those categories to do nutrition research. And again, I think they're doing this in a really well-meaning way. They want to know, are these ultra-processed foods leading to poorer health outcomes? Now, this is really tricky because, as the paper summarised, food is complicated and people are also complicated. This is a great paper to read if you want to learn more about nutrition research. And to add to that, because I mentioned that NOVA categorization is really subjective, if you give a group of dietitians a group of foods and you say, please put these into the NOVA categories, there's widespread disagreement within a group of people who are trained to do exactly that kind of thing. So this also isn't helped by the fact that the media likes to talk about food in a really, really black and white way, but this is exactly where we need a lot of nuance when we're interpreting nutritional studies. And I also think there are lots of people criticising Nova and Montero really unfairly because his classification system is being misused. So, back to my beans on toast. It's a pretty solid meal, right? I've got here some fibre, some protein, some carbs, some fats, some vitamins and minerals, maybe a little bit high in salt. It's also a really quick and affordable meal. Now, is it ultra-processed? Well, yeah, if I look at where the products that were in the meal came from, they come from factories all across Europe. And if I'm concerned about nutrition, I should look at the nutrition. But it doesn't really make much sense to me to demonise a plate of food like that during a cost of living crisis. Because I think there's a lot of classism in the ultra-processed food debate. There's a lot of messaging about guilt and shame if you can't make food from scratch in a kitchen, or if you can't afford sort of expensive artisanal breads like this. But anyway, what's all of this got to do with sustainability? Well, one of the groups of foods that you hear a lot about that are ultra-processed are plant-based meats. So these are plant and fungal proteins that have been processed and formulated to taste like plant-based meat. And I've seen loads of headlines this Veganuary about these products being ultra-processed. And if you look at some of the language that's being used, fake, chemicals, unnatural, artificial, it's really inciting that food neophobia that I mentioned at the beginning. And if you really want a challenge, try to define what these words mean. That's really, really hard. So I think part of this question of whether these things are unnatural or not has to do with our poor understanding of where our food comes from. Because if we think about crops in a field or animals skipping merrily in a farm, we then just think about, oh, they end up in the supermarket, and we don't really think about, or we choose to not think about, what happens in between. It's a kind of black box. It's sometimes called the missing middle. And the reality is that food processing doesn't usually look that great, whatever the food. So here we have a photo from the production of some tofurkey. Here's an industrial mixer. This, in this case, is mixing some tofu, some soy sauce, and some water. And this is called stomach turning, this video, apparently. Well, what this article failed to do was show the alternative, because there's a process to turn a turkey into a roast. And I promise you, it's a lot more stomach turning. And a lot of this is hinging on this heuristic that natural is good and unnatural is bad. And I'm sure we can all think of some things that are natural that are not so great, and things like antibiotics that are perhaps unnatural but are really, really good. And this, again, going back to the margarine example, butter was called natural, and margarine, part of the messaging was that it was a really unnatural product. And I think if we're saying that plant-based meat is unnatural, the implication is that animal meat is natural. But in the UK, 85% of the food, of the meat on our supermarket shelves comes from factory farms. I think the word factory is a bit of a giveaway there. It's not hugely natural. So, let's just do a quick summary. Plant-based meats, UPFs? Yep. Is this a problem? Well, depends what you value. Are they healthy? Sorry, are they natural? That's entirely up to you and your definition. And I think what's important to touch on at the end is, are they healthy? And this just depends on you and your diet, and it also depends what you're comparing it to. It is a burger. It's not a health food. If you're comparing it to a salad, it's not going to come out very well. But if you're comparing a plant-based burger to a conventional animal burger, almost always they are healthier than the processed meat products they intend to replace. Okay? And there's a really good summary here if you look at this study that compares plant-based products with conventional meat products. You see that they're lowering calories, less fat, less saturated fat, higher fibre, and the thing they do fall down on sometimes is salt. So back to this question of sustainability. What's going on here? Well, the link here is between intensive animal agriculture and some of the most pressing problems in the world right now. It takes 18 times more land to farm beef burgers than it does veggie burgers. There can be up to a 98% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if you eat plant-based meat. It requires 10 times less water, and also there's less water pollution. Plants don't need to be injected with antibiotics, so we don't have the risk of antimicrobial resistance, and we can't catch zoonotic diseases from plants, so that's less of an issue. And 100% fewer animals suffer in factory farms if we eat plant-based meat. So, I think that in the same way, we've moved from a horse and cart to a car. We've moved from using a quill to a pen. We've gone from getting insulin from the pancreas of a pig to getting bacteria to make it. I feel that we can also transition from eating animal meat to eating a healthier, more sustainable alternative in plant-based meat. But my concern is, if the messages we're hearing is that we should avoid all ultra-processed food, then yes, we're going to shun a load of junk food, but we're also going to shun a load of healthier, cruelty-free, more sustainable products. So, to wrap up, my 5 key points. Semantics is important. Definitions are important. Food is really complicated. We should embrace food processing and formulation. It's nothing to be afraid of. And if we're talking about health, we need to focus on nutrition and what matters. And plant-based meat is better for humans and the planet.